All that fintech magic depends on one thing: India's domestic economic health. And there's good news on that front. Two important economic indicators are looking solid: inflation and industrial production. As central bankers would say, let's deal with inflation first. India's consumer price index fell to 4.25% in May, and that's a 25-month low. Inflation was around 7% in May last year. Now it's 4.25%. Now the Reserve Bank of India has a tolerance band for inflation, sort of like a preferred range. And the upper limit here is 6%, which means at 4.25, India's current inflation is well within that range, well below that 6% upper limit. Now look at other emerging markets. In Argentina, inflation is almost 98%. In Turkey, 50%. Iran, 42%. Egypt, 21%. These countries are reeling under higher inflation. What about the developed world? The cost of living is already high in these countries, and inflation figures are a mixed bag. The numbers have cooled off in some countries like Canada, the US, France, and Italy, but others are not out of the woods, like the United Kingdom. Their retail inflation in the UK is 6.8%. In Germany, it's 6.2%. And this has a direct impact on economic output and health. But more on that later. For now, let's look at the second indicator, factory output. It is measured using something called IIP, Index of Industrial Production, IIP. It had fallen to 1.1% in March this year, but in April, it rebounded. The latest number is 4.2%. And this represents a notable increase for India. If you rewind to late last year, factory output was in the dumps. It was negative 4% in October 2022, meaning the output shrank. So the latest data shows a positive trajectory. And how is the rest of the world faring? China's industrial output was up 5.6% in April. But there's a catch. The market expectation was much higher for China, more than 10% in fact. So the pace of China's industrial recovery has been slower than expected. Could that be an opportunity for India? It could, but a lot depends on the RBI. That's India's central bank. For booming growth, you need to cut interest rates. You need to make loans cheaper. But is the RBI ready for that? Most experts say it's not. I mentioned that 6% inflation is the upper tolerance limit. Right now, it's well under that, 4.25%. But the RBI will look for a sustained dip, perhaps below 4%. It will also look for clues from the US Federal Reserve, that's America's central bank, the US Fed. It is still hiking interest rates. Once the Americans stop, other banks are expected to follow. So India, you could say, is on the starting line, ready to begin the sprint. It's all about waiting for the buzzer. But some of the other sprinters are nowhere in the picture. In fact, they may not even turn up. Take a look at this map. It shows three sets of countries, those already in recession, those at risk of recession, and those expected to escape. Germany is already in recession. They've had 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, which is technically recession. Next in line could be the United Kingdom, the UK. They have a 75% chance of recession this year. New Zealand has 70%, the US 65%, Australia 50%, and Canada 60%. What about India? As things stand, there is a 0% chance of recession in India. Saudi Arabia too is doing well, just 5% chance. China is at 12%, Brazil at 15%. So the big takeaway is this: the developed world is not out of the woods, but India appears to be safe. How did that happen? How did India buck the global trend? Well, you can't point at one specific reason for that. It's a combination of many policy choices, really. We look at 3 of them. For starters, cheap crude from Russia. That has really worked. By not taking sides in the war, New Delhi got good deals. And that's one reason why inflation is under control. The second reason is related to the pandemic. Do you remember what most governments did during the pandemic? They announced stimulus packages, and most of them were cash transfers. The US, for instance, spent about $250 billion on it. American citizens got checks up to $1,200. I'm sure it helped them, but there's a downside to such policies. More cash supply leads to more inflation. It's economics 101. But India tried another route. Things like free food distribution, loan concessions, more investment in pandemic-hit sectors. Perhaps that cashless approach worked for India. Because the biggest problem for developed economies is inflation. They've controlled it with interest hikes. But what happens if they pause? For all we know, it could shoot right back up. And that's where India is better placed. The RBI paused interest hikes back in April, yet inflation is sliding every month. What happens next is mostly out of India's hand. One is, of course, the global economy. The other is monsoons and El Nino. That's the third thing that has worked in India's favor so far, some good old luck. If you've been to India or live here, you're familiar with the wonders of UPI, a three-letter phenomenon that has transformed daily lives. You pull out your phone, scan a QR code and make a payment, as simple as that. And now India is sharing it with the rest of the world. UPI is all set to become India's next big export. Some countries in the neighborhood already use it. Soon, Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain may also have UPI. India is talking to them to enable bank-to-bank transfers and cross-border transactions via UPI. Reports say the talks are in early stages and that the Gulf countries are showing a lot of interest. This will help Indians in the region, the Indian diaspora. We're talking about more than 7 million Indians. They regularly send money home. Every year, non-resident Indians or NRIs in the Gulf send back $89 billion. That's 65% of India's total remittances. So far, they've been doing it through banks, but imagine making these transfers from their phones with minimum charges. And yes, charges would apply. You see, UPI transactions within India are free, but if you make a cross-border transaction, then there will be a fee, anywhere between $3 to $6, according to one report. And it may be worth the cost, given what UPI has been able to do in India. UPI stands for Unified Payments Interface, but it's now become a ubiquitous payments interface. It's everywhere. Go to the remotest parts of India and you'll most likely find vendors with QR codes. Go to the busiest parts of your city and the people you see may not be carrying a photo ID, but almost all of them will have a UPI ID. It's an instant payment system. It runs mostly on a mobile phone. It is used to transfer money in real time just by scanning a code. And its success at home is driving its global expansion. UPI has some clear strengths. The first, of course, is convenience. It has disrupted payments in India. You don't have to carry cash anymore. The technology is easy to use. All payment apps support it, and all major banks have adopted it. This interoperability has fueled the high adoption. UPI's second strength is its reliability. And like always, I have some numbers. In January this year, about 8 billion transactions happened through UPI. 8 billion. Do you know how much money was transferred? Nearly $200 billion. Going by the Indian government's assessment, India does more digital transactions than the US, the UK, Germany and France combined.
The digital payment transactions amounted to $1.5 trillion annualized basis. And that is, if you compare the total of US digital transactions, UK, Germany, France, combine the four, multiply by 4.
4 times bigger. That's massive. And this ecosystem is growing. The UPI is used by close to 300 million individuals and 50 million merchants. This proves how resilient the system is. So there is convenience, there is scale, and there is reliability. But the biggest benefit of UPI is financial inclusion. I have another statistic for you. In 2022, UPI transactions in semi-urban and rural stores skyrocketed. By how much? A record 650%, 650%. And these are towns and cities where until recently a lot of citizens did not even have a bank account. Today they are paying with their phones. The world is taking notice of this success story. Many countries want to adopt India's UPI. The trend in fact began with Bhutan. Bhutan adopted the UPI in 2021. Last year, Nepal joined the club. So did the UAE. Indian travelers to the UAE were allowed to pay through their UPI-linked accounts. Now, going by one estimate, at least 23 countries support UPI in some form or the other, and the story gets better. Recently, NRIs have been given greater access to UPI. Indians who do not reside in India, non-resident Indians, they can use their international numbers to send money. As of now, this facility is available in 10 countries and regions: Singapore, Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, Oman, Qatar, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the United Kingdom. These countries support this arrangement for now. The list is expected to grow. India launched the UPI as a public utility, and now it is sharing it with the rest of the world. Remember this guy? You can blame him for most of the problems on social media. That's Jack Dorsey. He founded Twitter, sold it, and is now recounting the good old days. This time he spoke about India. He was talking about the relationship between Twitter and governments and how some governments tried to muzzle critics. Jack Dorsey says India was one of them. In fact, let me quote from what he said. It manifested in ways such as, we will shut Twitter down in India, which is a very large market for us. We will raid the homes of your employees, which they did. We will shut down your offices if you don't follow suit. And this is India, a democratic country. This is what Jack Dorsey said. Let me give you some context. Dorsey is specifically talking about the farmers' protest in India. It happened some 2 years back. He says the Indian government threatened Twitter then. Block our critics or we will shut you down. That's apparently what the government said. And how has the government responded to these claims? With a defiant rejection. Listen in to Union Minister Rajiv Chandrasekhar.
Jack Dorsey was the CEO of Twitter during a very, very dubious period in Twitter's history. What he has said is an outright lie, and I have said that publicly and I'm reiterating it again. Twitter is a company that believed that it was not necessary for it to comply with Indian law. It believed that it did not have to comply with Indian law and made up its rules as it went along.
The minister also said Twitter was being used to spread misinformation, plus it was refusing to comply with Indian laws. You may remember that showdown. Twitter fought against India's IT rules for 2 years. They wanted to operate in India, but they did not want to follow the Indian law. It was only in 2022 that they accepted the rules. The government also says no one went to jail, nor was Twitter shut down. So what's the truth here? Let's look at the facts. Did the government of India ask Twitter to take down accounts? Yes, they did. What kind of accounts and how many? Around 1,200 accounts linked to Khalistan mostly. And Twitter did comply at first, but later on, they made a U-turn. They restored some accounts claiming freedom of expression. Now, do you see the problem here? Twitter decided what was permissible and what was not. Not the court, not the government of the country. Twitter decided to take that call. Now, I know Twitter is supposed to be a company, but that's not how Jack Dorsey imagined it. Let me quote from his words. I don't believe anyone should own or run Twitter. It wants to be a public good at a protocol level, not a company. So Dorsey wanted Twitter to be a public good. Well, that means following the rules. That also means holding yourself to government standards. Twitter did not do that in 2021. And now 2 years later, Dorsey alleges intimidation. He says his team was threatened. Frankly, it's a he said, she said situation. The government claims Dorsey's track record discredits him, which to an extent is true. I'll give you another example. Do you remember the 2021 Capitol riots in the US? Twitter was quick to crack down during the riots. No government request was needed. Twitter acted on its own. They deplatformed then President Donald Trump. But fun fact, the Taliban continued to be welcome on Twitter. Tells you about their double standards. My point is not about Trump really or the Taliban. It's about Twitter's myopia. When things happen in the US, they're quick to act or react. But when similar things happen elsewhere, they drag their feet. All US tech giants face this problem. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, even latest tech products like ChatGPT. Recently, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman was in India. OpenAI is the company behind ChatGPT. You know what Altman said? It's hopeless for India to create something like ChatGPT. Those were the words he used. Hopeless, he said. And it was the same with Twitter and TikTok. Someone else developed these platforms and we adopted them. Perhaps it's time to change that trend. We keep talking about our IT sector, how India can be a tech superpower and a talent hub, how the sector is expected to be worth $100 billion by 2025. It already employs around 5 million people, and yet India rarely leads the tech race. We are among the biggest markets for American tech companies, but why aren't we building our own? Is it lack of ambition? Or lack of government support, or something else? Well, whatever be the reason, it calls for introspection, because companies like Twitter will never serve India's interests. Their CEOs will dress up to be grilled by US senators, but they won't answer questions in India. They won't want to comply with laws in India. They would much rather fling allegations 2 years later. Have you ever been squished into a tight plane seat? Do you curse inadequate leg room on flights or fellow passengers who willfully recline their thrones? Well, if yes, then this story is for you, because we get it. Uncomfortable airplane seats can make even a short journey to paradise feel like forever. But here's some good news. The future of air travel may look very different. I'm talking about economy class bunk beds and double-decker seats. Also increased accessibility for passengers with wheelchairs. Our next report tells you what your seat could look like.
Look at these purple-lit pods with pillows and eye masks awaiting on each bed. They look much more like the bunks you would find on European trains, except with more of a space-age vibe. In fact, these pods look like they belong in a sci-fi movie. But they could soon be front and center in the aisle of the economy section of Air New Zealand. Yes, New Zealand's national carrier is taking good sleep to the skies. Now, decent shut-eye is a privilege on any flight, one that is reserved for those who can afford seats in business or first class. But the lie-flat seats are flat out of reach for most of the passengers, and this is an attempt to change that. It's a concept called Skynest, the first of its kind. It reimagines economy class seating and offers not only bunk beds in the skies, but also a glimmer of hope to its sleep-starved passengers. And this isn't a futuristic concept. It's set to hit the skies in 2024, with each bunk costing about $250 to $380 for every 4 hours. But purple pods aren't the only seating innovation that's underway. There are other ways to ride the wind, and a 23-year-old airplane seat designer has a few ideas. His name is Alejandro Nunes Vicente, and he believes that double-decker flying is the future of economy seating. Basically, 2 rows of seats with one on top of the other. This innovation has made a lot of buzz and garnered a mixed response. Would you sit directly below a fellow passenger on a flight? Sounds odd, right? Some say it makes a case for potential claustrophobia. Others say this design will only help companies. They will cram more seats on the plane. But then there are some who are more than willing to try it out, saying that it optimizes space inside the flight. And while the lack of sleep and comfort are 2 major factors ailing flyers, another key issue is poor accessibility. Many times, wheelchairs are damaged in flights. US airlines on average mishandle about 10,500 mobility devices annually. They damage about 1.5 wheelchairs for every 100 flown. A well-known disability activist even died due to this. She developed complications after she rented a wheelchair because her custom wheelchair was destroyed during a United Airlines flight. And this isn't just an American problem. Experts say while data may be lacking, this problem is all-pervasive. But now there may be a solution. A new airplane seat debuted this month. It allows travelers to remain in their own wheelchairs during flights. These wheelchairs would attach to the flight seats, and passengers will be able to use the airplane's headrest and tray tables. This innovation is being called a crucial step forward. It's also economical. Reports say that wheelchair-bound passengers spend over $58 billion on travel annually. Moves like this will make it a win-win for both sides. Moral of the story: air travel is changing. Seating innovation is taking to the skies. And soon enough, we'll know if these ideas fly in the real world.
And speaking of problems that last for generations, let's talk about climate change. Parts of India and Pakistan are bracing for a major cyclone. The UK recently reported a heat wave. Supercharged typhoons, wildfires and droughts have become commonplace. We see the news, we know the risks, and we often wonder, what can we as individuals do about it? Well, 16 American children are showing the way. They're in the US state of Montana and they're making history. They've filed a case against their government over the climate crisis. They've sued the state of Montana, and it's the first such case ever to go to trial in the US. Its outcome could have implications beyond America, though. It could empower more people across the world to hold their government accountable for climate change. Here's a report.
They say children are the future. But what future are we leaving behind for children? One riddled with extreme weather events, where constant greenhouse gas emissions lead to irreversible climate change? Well, some children have refused this future and are fighting to protect the environment. We're talking about a group of 16 children from the US state of Montana. They have sued the state government for its fossil fuel-friendly policies, and they're actually being heard in court. In 2020, this group of children filed the lawsuit. They were between 2 and 18 years old at the time. They cited Montana's state constitution. The constitution guarantees the right to a clean and healthful environment. Yes, that's written into Montana's constitution. And the children say that the state government is blatantly ignoring that clause. Montana has the largest coal reserves in the US, and it has promoted the coal mining industry over the years. An example is a law passed in May. It limits the effectiveness of environmental regulators. It stops them from assessing the climate impacts of proposed fossil fuel projects, like coal mines or power plants. Obviously, this makes it easier for companies to flout environmental rules. The 16 children from Montana are fighting to highlight this, because the lawsuit itself does not really have a solution. Even if the children win the case, the court will only be able to issue a declaratory judgment, meaning it can say that the state's constitution was violated, but the court cannot formulate new laws. That remains in the hands of politicians. So this lawsuit will not be able to stop Montana's poor climate practices. And yet, the government is fighting back hard, using every tactic possible. First, there was slander. The state called the lawsuit a mere publicity stunt, a waste of taxpayer money, aimed at shutting down responsible energy development. Then Montana tried to get the case dismissed, first completely, then partially. But it didn't work. Then they took it to Montana's Supreme Court last week. This was a bid to delay the trial, but none of it helped. The trial has begun. It'll last 2 weeks. The judge will then produce the verdict. Experts say that Montana is unlikely to accept criticism, that it will make an appeal to a higher court, even if it's only a declaratory judgment. After all, fossil fuel companies won't want a negative outcome in such a high-profile case. It may pave the way for more such lawsuits across the US and the world, which is what the children ultimately want. Even if the Montana court can't undo the damage caused by their government, it can serve as a precedent, a rallying cry for environmentalists everywhere, one they can use in the next fight against the fossil fuel industry.
And now it's time for Vantage shots, images that tell the story. Starting with the US, tens of thousands of dead fish washed up at beaches in Texas. Officials say low oxygen levels in warm water has led to the situation. Meanwhile, SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket delivered 72 spacecraft to orbit. It has now returned to Earth. And South Korea's capital, Seoul, is marking the 10th anniversary of its famous K-pop band, BTS. Landmarks across Seoul were illuminated in the band's signature color, purple. And finally, what makes this day significant, June the 13th? We're taking you back in history. And this is a rather somber story. On this day in 1997, a fire broke out in a movie theatre in India's capital, Delhi. So you may have heard of the Upahar cinema fire. This happened during the screening of a famous Bollywood film. The theatre had only one functional emergency exit. More than 50 people were killed. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
क्या बुलाते हो ये क्या